All right, so this is the final section of Chapter 2, Section 5, and we are going to conclude this chapter with a discussion of specialization, comparative advantage, and trade. So this will be sort of another extension of the model we've learned with the PPC, and we'll see how we can use this model to talk about specialization and trade and why that's an important aspect of growing economies. So we'll start off this section by defining what specialization means. You might have a good idea of what that means. More than likely, it's not an uncommon word, but let's make sure we understand what we mean it to mean in economics. So for us as economists, specialization is just the organization of economic activity, either among different individuals or different regions. And what's so important about specialization in economics is that it allows us to have greater productivity as a society. Okay, so that's why we care about this concept. It allows us to have greater productivity, which is basically, in other words, a PPC that is pushed further out than it otherwise would be if we did not have specialization. And specialization is basically the result of something called comparative advantage. So comparative advantage is when a person or a region or a society is able to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost. So in other words, they have to give up less to produce that thing. They have a lower cost of production. So if you'll recall, this was one of our definitions of efficiency, right? Being able to produce at a minimum or lower cost. So comparative advantage is basically directly related to efficiency. And something to keep in mind is that this is a relative concept. Okay, so you have to compare at least two or more individuals or two or more regions in order to be able to determine a comparative advantage. You can't just look at a single individual and say that they have a comparative advantage. You have to make a comparison. So in that sense, it's a relative concept. It's relative to somebody else, right? Or some other region. It's relative. And then this is in contrast to a related concept called absolute advantage. And this is just the ability to produce more of a good or service given a quantity of labor or resources. So it's not the same thing. It can be easy to confuse them, but here there's no mention of cost, right? It's just who can produce more, right, in absolute terms. So that's why it's called absolute advantage. But there is no consideration of cost, which might be it might seem like a good idea for someone to produce something if they have an absolute advantage, but really what we should be thinking about is, well, what do they have to give up, right? If they have to give up a lot, even though their absolute advantage might be high, they can produce a high number given a set amount of resources. If they also have to give up a lot in order to produce that, then maybe they shouldn't necessarily be the one producing it. There might be somebody with a lower opportunity cost of production, and they should be the one specializing in the production of that good. An equivalent way to think about absolute advantage is the ability to produce the same quantity of a good or service using fewer resources. So again, this is another one of those two sides of the same coin, dual problems like we talked about with efficiency. But they're basically the same thing. Now, let's tie this back into our rationality assumption, right? So rational individuals choose their comparative advantage and specialize. So just as an example of that, I have a comparative advantage to most people, relative to most people, in teaching economics, right? So that's why I am specializing in teaching economics, because compared to most other people, I have to give up very little to teach economics. My opportunity cost is very low compared to most other people, and so that's why I choose to specialize in teaching economics. Now, what specialization leads to is basically what's called a division of labor, right? People specialize and divide up labor according to what they're best at in terms of comparative advantage, right? So, I could give myself a haircut. I'm not good at it. I have a high opportunity cost of haircuts. So rather than doing it myself, I pay someone to cut my hair, right? Now, Adam Smith, our founder of economics, the guy that wrote The Wealth of Nations, he had an anecdote about pin making, right? So pins like sewing pins, right? And he talked about the division of labor within pin making. So I can't remember exactly how the story goes, but basically I think there's one person that forms the metal of the pin, and then there's another person that forms the head of the pin, and it's because each of these tasks can be a point of specialization, right? Another example that you may have heard of, maybe in a history class, is Henry Ford's assembly line. So back in the early 1900s, when Ford Motor Company was just becoming it was a relatively new company, but it was growing quickly. And one of the reasons for that is because Henry Ford realized the power of the division of labor and specialization. So rather than having, say, a team of 5 employees build an entire car over a month or two, he would give employees very, very specific tasks, right? So one employee might mount a tire or a wheel, and another employee would install the radio. Another employee would install the dashboard. Another employee would install the seats, and so on, right? So, and what this allows is basically for each individual employee to get really, really good at what they do so that they can do it at a very low opportunity cost. And as we mentioned, when people specialize in their comparative advantages, that leads to higher productivity. So Ford was the pioneer in this sort of method of manufacture, the assembly line. And so, and I'll tie that back too into our definition of technology. So what Henry Ford did was he developed a new type of manufacturing technology, the assembly line. Okay, so recall that technology is not what we usually think of it as, right? In economics, it's a knowledge of how to produce something, and that's an innovation that Henry Ford created. Just to talk a little bit more about the division of labor. Hopefully I illustrated that pretty well with those examples, but again, the division of labor is just the segregation of resources, such as employees, into specific different tasks. Okay, so again, there you go. For example, automobile production. One worker puts on bumpers, another worker puts on doors, and so on. So that's just a real life example of the division of labor. Now, the analysis of absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and specialization is applicable to not only individuals, but also groups of people and nations. So, and ultimately what this leads to is trade, right? So if we think about specialization and division of labor into regions, say the United States and China, China has a lower opportunity cost of producing certain things. And so they have a comparative advantage in producing those things. And the United States likewise has a lower opportunity cost of producing other things, and so has a comparative advantage relative to China in producing those things. And so if we specialize, if China specializes in what it's good at and the United States specializes in what it's good at, we ultimately come to a situation where we probably want to trade with China, right? Because we want some of the things that China specializes in, and they want some of the things that we specialize in. And so this development of specialization and division of labor ultimately leads to the opportunity for trade. And anytime there's trade, there are gains from trade, which we will talk about more, especially in Chapter 3 in the next chapter. So like I said, when nations specialize, they do so because they have a comparative advantage. And so they specialize in what they're good at, what they have the lowest opportunity cost in, what they have a comparative advantage in, and then they trade with the rest of the world. And like we said earlier, when people specialize, it leads to, or when nations specialize, in either case, it leads to higher productivity, which is basically an improvement in economic efficiency. So output goes up, right? Our PPC shifts out, our global PPC shifts out. and this allows people's average standards of living to go up, right? So everybody benefits from specialization in trade, which think about that with regard to some of the trade policies that the United States has pursued lately, right? So Trump's trade war with China. Think about that and think about whether or not that's really a good thing based on what we're learning here. All right. All right, so let's wrap up this chapter with a discussion of the opportunity of waiting in gridlocked traffic. So at prices starting at $150,000, this company, Becker Automotive, can convert chauffeur-driven vans and limos into mobile offices or custom-built homes away from home. So this is a really interesting service. Customers of those vans and limos can avoid sacrificing time they could devote to activities they otherwise would pursue at home or in an office setting, right? So basically, think about the ability if you're able to buy one of these vans or limos converted into a mobile office or home, you could feasibly be just as productive as you would be in an office or at home, but in some other place. So that would allow you to travel, but also still work, right? So an interesting thing there, the opportunity cost of being gridlocked, right? If you were in traffic and you had one of these vans, I guess you'd need a chauffeur as well, someone driving, or maybe it's a self-driving van. If you have one of these converted vans, you could be feasibly working as you commute to work, which is currently not something that most people can do right now. So people sit in traffic, at least during normal times, not so much right now, but people sit in traffic and they have to devote their time and attention to driving. They can't work or do anything like that. So this is sort of an example of an increase in technology, right? If we have this increased technology, then people could feasibly, especially if they're self-driving, people could feasibly commute to work, and while they are commuting to work, they could be working at the same time, right? So that would allow a higher level of productivity, higher level of efficiency, more output, more production. So that's an interesting application of the ideas we've learned here in this chapter. All right, now let's also, in wrapping up this chapter, go back to our Navy example, right, with missiles and ships. So hopefully now you can see how we can use our new PPC model in analyzing this problem, right? So the Navy faces this problem involving production possibility between missiles, shipborne weapons, and its fleet of ships. Right? There's a trade-off. If it wants more missiles, it has to produce fewer ships or replace fewer ships. But as it turns out, the Navy has recently developed a new technology called a railgun. So this is another type of weapon that can potentially replace missiles, traditional missile technology, and it does so at 40 times less expense. It's 40 times less expensive than missiles because there's no explosive warhead, there's no fuel cost. It's basically a heavy piece of metal, a big rod of metal that is shot out of a gun with electricity and magnetic force. And so there's a lot lower costs, but it still has basically the same effect in terms of a weapon. And so this has been an increase in technology. Now it will shift out our PPC, okay, but it will do so in a very interesting way that we haven't seen yet, and we'll see that in the next slide. But basically, this railgun technology allows the Navy to expand its fleet of ships while continuing to produce the same number of weapons as before, right? So what does that look like in terms of our PPC? Well, basically, it's still a shift out, but it's lopsided, right? So this technology is only useful in producing more weapons, and so it's a lopsided shift. You'll notice that the intercept on the y-axis, ships per year, that intercept doesn't change, right? It's still in the same intercept, and that's because this technology doesn't improve our ability to produce more ships at all, but it does allow us to produce more weapons. So it's a lopsided shift on the side of weapons, But nevertheless, it's still economic growth in a sense. And interestingly enough, even though it's only the technology is only useful for producing more weapons, it actually allows us to produce more ships as well. It lowers the opportunity cost of producing more ships or producing more weapons. That's actually, we can see that in the fact that the PPC kind of gets a little bit flatter, and that's what translates into a lower opportunity cost there. And so what's illustrated here, points A and B, is that with the increase in technology of weapons development, we can produce the same number of weapons and more ships now. But we could also go from point A to another point where we have more weapons and more ships. So that's kind of interesting. All right, so that concludes Chapter 2. So we talked about why everybody, whether they're poor or affluent, faces the problem of scarcity. And keep in mind that scarcity is not the same as poverty. It's also not the same thing as a shortage. We talked about in that section how needs are not objectively definable in economics. We don't have a definition for needs in economics. So basically everything in economics boils down to a want, and wants are things in which we place a positive value, right? In section 2, we talked about why this problem of scarcity causes people to make choices and consider opportunity costs as well as other trade-offs. And it's because people have limited resources, and so they can't satisfy all of their wants. So they have to make choices, and those choices involve giving up something always, right? You always have to give up something to do something else. In section 3, we talked about why obtaining increasing amounts of some good necessarily requires giving up more and more units of other goods, right? And it's because of this fact, that again is what accounts for our bowed out PPC, and that comes from the fact that resources to some degree are specialized. So in our Navy example, right, that technology, that resource was specialized only in weapons, right? So that's what we saw in section 3. In section 4, we talked about our particular use of our PPC model in looking at the trade-off between consumption today and future consumption, the production of capital goods for future consumption, and we talked about how that relates to economic growth. So as we produce more capital goods, we can have higher economic growth in the future. But of course, producing more capital goods comes at the cost of producing consumption goods. So we give up some consumption if we want higher economic growth in the future. And then in section 5, we talked about the difference between absolute and comparative advantage, and we defined what these concepts are. So of course, they're pretty similar, but comparative advantage is probably the more important one, and it relates to whoever has the lowest opportunity cost. So who gives up the least to make that thing, that person has the comparative advantage. And again, remember, it's a relative concept, so you have to compare two or more individuals or economies or regions. And then that's in contrast to absolute advantage. Who can make the most given resources without thinking about the costs, without thinking about what they have to give up, right? So that's absolute advantage. All right, so that's been chapter 2. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video for chapter 3.